Welcome to another installment of our expert series. The CDA Institute recently sat down with Crisis Group's UN Director Richard Gowan. Richard oversees Crisis Group's advocacy work at the United Nations, liaising with diplomats and UN officials in New York. Richard and I discussed how the UN is grappling with the successive crises of climate change, COVID, and the war in Ukraine, how the war in Ukraine has impacted the dynamics of the Security Council, and what we can expect from China at the Security Council in the months ahead. To kick off this discussion, how is the UN grappling with the three successive crises of climate change, the COVID-19 pandemic, and now the war in Ukraine? Has the war created any opportunities to reform the UN and global governance?
Look, I think it's too early to say what the long-term impact of the Ukrainian war on international order will be. We don't know if this is a war that concludes with Russia weakened and failing on the battlefield, or whether Russia will eke out some sort of win. And whatever happens on the battlefield is going to have a huge effect, I think, on diplomacy in the post-war era. It's possible that you have a situation where you have some sort of peace agreement that is difficult for everyone, but both Ukraine's allies and Russia will end up sort of coming together in places like the UN to sign off on a deal, or you may just have a long, cold peace and a very fragmented international order. So there's a huge range of options on the table. I think what you can say, looking at your broader question, is that this war has added to a strong sense that the international system we have is fragile and is struggling to deal both with non-traditional threats like the pandemic and very classic threats such as big power war. And I do feel, certainly in conversations around the UN, that this is going to give rise to a lot of talk about the need to reform the UN, the need to rethink the role and rules of the Security Council. I think we're in for a couple of years where global governance reform is going to be a very popular intellectual topic. But I would, again, strike a slight note of caution, which is I started working around the UN in the aftermath of the Iraq War, and back in 2004, 2005, after the shock of Iraq sank in, we had a period where everyone was saying, well, we have to reform the Security Council, we have to rethink international order. And in the end, the results of that period of big thinking was pretty paltry, and you didn't see specifically any major changes to the Security Council. So the fact that people are talking about reforming global governance doesn't mean that they actually will get on and do the reform. I think you have to distinguish between fundamental reforms and marginal improvements to the existing system. And I think we have to be honest that fundamental reforms to bodies like the Security Council remain pretty remote prospects. And there are a number of reasons for that. The first is that if you're any credible reform to a body like the Security Council, politically has to have the buy-in of not only the US and its friends, but also Russia, and I think very importantly, China. And right now, we're not in a situation where those five powers could seriously be expected to sit down and have a negotiation about fundamental reforms to the UN Charter. And then in procedural terms, there's an article, I think it's Article 108 in the UN Charter, that says that you can't change anything about this document unless all five permanent members of the Council ratify it. So basically, while it feels very unjust and is very unjust, Russia has a veto power not only over resolutions on Ukraine, but also on any sort of alterations to the system that it is exploiting to its own advantage. On the other hand, you can take steps to try and ameliorate the flaws in the institutional architecture. And we've already seen one small example of that, which was Liechtenstein, tiny Liechtenstein, floated an initiative saying that when countries use their veto in the Security Council, they should then go to the UN General Assembly, where every member of the organization has a seat, and explain why they used that veto within 10 days. And the idea is that this will increase the reputational cost for you using your veto in the Security Council. Now, that passed actually by consensus. Even the Russians and Chinese agreed to accept that that new initiative against the backdrop of the war. And I think there may be more limited improvements of that type that could incrementally improve the functioning of the UN system. I think there is also a lot of lessons to be learned about how the UN, but also the international financial institutions and other big economic players are responding to current supply chain shocks and food shocks. I think that you can combine lessons from COVID and from what's happening now in the international economy to think about ways to sort of improve responses to similar global economic shocks in future. So there's a lot you can do, but there's actually not much you can do about the really core tenets of the UN Charter.
Do you think that perhaps the war in Ukraine has distracted from other pertinent global issues and initiatives, such as addressing climate change, the energy transition, and hitting other climate targets?
I think in the short term, it certainly has. And even if you just focus on international peace and security, diplomats working at the Security Council here in New York say the amount of time that's available to really think about Afghanistan or really think about the Sahel has massively shrunk. And the focus of the council is narrowly and intensely on Ukraine. And that's something which disappoints ambassadors from Africa or Asia, because they see their own regional interests getting short shrift when you have a crisis in Europe. I think more generally, this is certainly draining attention from the pandemic and the process of recovery from the pandemic. That was by far and away the main topic of discussion in international organizations in 2020 and 2021. Now it's almost a half forgotten memory. And I think this is problematic because actually what we're seeing coming out of Ukraine are a series of shocks to international supply chains, the international food system, that are compounding economic problems that are still resonating from the pandemic. So actually, we aren't thinking, we aren't thinking about a broader array of global threats. We're focusing narrowly on Ukraine, and at the same time, Ukraine is actually exacerbating a lot of the international economic problems and international supply problems that were there already. Some people, like UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, are trying to join all the dots, and they're trying to say, Ukraine is a war, but it's also a global crisis that in many ways is expanding the global crisis that was already there. But if you're a policymaker sitting in Washington or in London, that's a very interesting point, but your time horizon has shrunk to a few weeks and your geographical focus has shrunk to Eastern Ukraine.
How has the war impacted the dynamics of the Security Council? Has it impacted cooperation and ongoing negotiations between Russia, China, and the US regarding other items on the agenda of the Security Council?
So as I've said, it's sucked a huge amount of energy out of discussions of other issues. And this is something which a lot of diplomats comment on. It's also made relations between the Russians and the Western powers extremely toxic. And, in essence, American diplomats, European diplomats are under instruction to only engage to a bare minimum with Russian officials. Is at the very simplest level, British officials, for example, are barred from any sort of social engagement with the Russians, and so the mood is very, very tense. That said, there is some good news. There have been, I think, tacit agreements amongst the big powers to try and limit the damage of Ukraine to discussions on other files. And we've actually seen the Security Council in the last 3 months pass an important resolution on the future of the UN role in Afghanistan, basically resetting the UN to act as a major point of contact with the Taliban. That was something which both the US and the Europeans, but also China, really wanted to see go through, and Russia didn't block it. We've seen the Council deal in a fairly routine fashion with discussions about Somalia and South Sudan. And so overall, the situation hasn't seemed too bad, but there is one worrying footnote to that just this week, which is that yesterday, on Thursday, the Americans tabled a resolution imposing new sanctions on North Korea because of its latest missile tests, and China and Russia united to block that. And I think that's a worrying sign of the overall decline of big power relations in the Security Council. The Security Council is structured to function when the big five members are more or less aligned, or when they can work out compromises over their differences. It's not structured to resolve conflicts in which those five powers are active participants. And, you can go through a history of other conflicts, most obviously Iraq in recent memory, but also the Falklands back in the 1980s, where one of the P5 was a party to the conflict, and there were discussions, of course, in the Security Council, but every time the Security Council couldn't really affect the outcome. And so, more specifically, some people expressed surprise that the Council can do nothing over Ukraine, but the Council wasn't able to act over Ukraine in 2014 because of Russia's veto. And further back in history, Russia used its veto to stop the Council acting over Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. So anyone who was surprised that the Security Council cannot resolve the Ukrainian war really knows nothing about the history of the Council. That said, I think that it is very fair for critics to say this, this fundamental failure of the body demonstrates its inherent limitations as a cornerstone of international order. And Russia has exploited its status in the Security Council not only to block action over Ukraine, but also to block action over Syria and to alleviate pressure on other countries where it has interests, like Ethiopia during the recent Ethiopian war. It is an enormous problem, and it's a problem that could well get worse.
In what ways can we expect China to maneuver at the UN in the coming months? What do you think Beijing has learned watching events unfold from the invasion to the Western response?
I think the general feeling amongst Western China watchers is that, firstly, Beijing, presumably knew the war was coming, and broadly speaking, China has been on Russia's side. But it's interesting to note that at the UN, that's not really how China has been behaving. China has, whenever possible, abstained on resolutions deploring Russia's aggression. It's abstained on resolutions of that type in the Security Council, in the General Assembly, and in the Human Rights Council. The Chinese have not used their very considerable diplomatic leverage in New York to build a coalition of non-Western countries to back Russia. And actually, we've heard that in private, on issues like Afghanistan and more generally, the Chinese have been quietly going to other members of the Security Council and other states and saying, what can we do to avoid this crisis blowing up the UN as a whole? The Chinese have actually been quite pragmatic and quite careful not to shackle themselves to Moscow at the UN over the last 3 months. Now, I would note that dynamics may be changing after this this clash over North Korea this week in the Security Council. But my overall interpretation is that the Chinese, like the Americans, in fact, see the UN as a place to compete for influence. And in the last 10 years, China has massively increased its efforts to project influence at the UN. But they also see it as a place where they can keep compromising with the West. They don't want to end up where the Russians are at the UN now, which is in a state of just constant diplomatic combat with the West. The Chinese are still looking for compromises where they are available. And I think that's one glimmer of hope in this crisis, that we're not seeing a complete breakdown of big power politics, despite the very high level tension over Ukraine. The one thing that I think is worth highlighting is that although the Security Council was inevitably paralyzed over Ukraine, the US and its European allies have done a pretty good job. Actually, I think a very good job of sort of maintaining a coalition in support of Ukraine in other UN forums like the General Assembly. And US diplomacy, both immediately on Ukraine, but also on other issues like the global food crisis, has been quite deft. We're now hearing diplomats from non-Western countries drawing a very sharp contrast between what they saw as the total failure of US leadership over COVID under President Trump and the sort of rather determined display of leadership that we're seeing over Ukraine. And I think that for the first time, a lot of diplomats from other countries here in New York are actually beginning to take the rhetoric about the US being back in the multilateral system quite seriously. There was a sense that last year that the Biden administration was only gradually sort of rebuilding US engagement with the UN system. A lot of diplomats would have liked to see Biden engage more at the UN. But on Ukraine, the US has really sort of pulled out all the stops and, really has both sort of acted well diplomatically itself and also coordinated well with the Europeans, which was almost impossible in the Trump era. So it's not the scenario we wanted to test US diplomacy at the UN, but it has actually been a diplomatic positive set of test results for Biden here in New York.